Humans are known to be the apex species on Earth. With our opposing thumbs, superior gray matter, and capacity for communication and knowledge, humans have emerged as the dominant species on Earth. But we are not apex predators. In the wilds of the Brazilian Amazon, spotted leopards bigger than wolves roam the forests, hidden by the thick vegetation. Amidst the vines, snakes that can be 4 times bigger than a man lurk in the silent hunt. In the Indian forest, tigers are the dominant force. In the northern cold areas, huge polar bears are unstoppable forces of nature. And in the salty waters of the ocean, a species of hunter reigns supreme: the shark. In today's video, we'll analyze the case of Rodney Temple and how he came into contact with one of nature's most dangerous hunters. It was October of 1972 with the Cane Bay Beach on St. Croix's North Shore on the paradise of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Rodney Temple, Brett Gilliam, and Robbie McIlvaine were going to the near beach to do some wall diving, a diving technique that involves swimming alongside the edges of coral reefs, reef walls, or other vertical underwater terrains, examining the beauty and exotic plant and animal life of the underwater ocean. The sport is common among lovers of exploration and travel. The 3 men were set to dive the walls of St. Croix's shore in search of samples for an experience at the local marine science lab. The place of the dive had been chosen 6 days earlier, with caches of supplies being set up in the place of the drop, and the research vessel already loaded with sediment traps, nets, and lines for the dive. The plan was to explore an area 2,010 feet down, around 65 meters, and take some photos of the area. Robert, Rodney, and Brett swam toward the equipment they'd set up earlier, snorkeling under the waves. They had done their research on the Virgin Islands for over 2 years now, and swimming, both for work and leisure, was a natural part of their day. They were ready to begin their day of work, setting up the equipment and talking about the strategy for the day, when Rodney suggested that they do the day's dive in 15 minutes to save time on decompression. Brett and Robert agreed and started to prepare for the dive. Rodney was the thinnest of the 3 men and the most experienced diver. While Brett and Robert got the heavy lifting, Robert did the paperwork. Because of this, Rodney was often the first or only one of them to descend for research. On the day of the dive, visibility was great and the waters were warm and calm. Rodney swam to the drop point set up about 125 feet away from where Robert and Brett were. He was floating on top of the wall. As Robert and Brett caught up with Rodney bringing the equipment to float on top of the diver, Rodney brought to their attention a peculiar sight in such shallow waters: 2 oceanic white-tipped sharks. It wasn't unusual for them to swim or dive near sharks, but these weren't shallow water sharks, usually found in deeper, colder waters. Seeing them so near to the coral was different, and Rodney was pointing them out excitedly. His explorer nature delighted in the sight. As Robert and Brett arranged the equipment, Rodney photographed the 2 predators. The sight was strange, though, too strange. Brett later commented that it was like walking off your back porch and seeing an African lion when you expected an alley cat. Nonetheless, they continued their research. After they finished arranging the equipment, Rodney concluded his notes on the start of the experiment, and as he'd proposed, they only had enough equipment prepared for about 20 minutes of exploration. White tips aren't the friendliest of shark species to have around when you're diving. They frequently bite the equipment and steal cables used in the dives, and divers have to employ buddy techniques to dive near them, with one on research and one with both eyes on the animal to dissuade any attempts to bite them. On this occasion, however, the 2 white tips that had come near the team had mostly left them alone. Still, their sight set off red alerts in Brett's mind. Rodney did little more than take photos of them, paying them no particular mind. The divers began their dive, and Rodney at the 210 feet point took his notes. Robert and Brett were about 50 feet above him. Brett couldn't stop thinking about the white tips. His mind was racing, and he was getting increasingly anxious about it. Robert and Brett waited at 175 feet for Rodney to join them. Resting over a ledge in the coral, they waited for their friend to start surfacing for decompression. They noticed that Rodney was starting to be late, and the pressure gauge on their equipment started to indicate a scenario of low oxygen. Brett shrugged at Robert as if to say, "What can I do about it?" It was then that they noticed a massive bubble exhaust coming from the deeper water. Something went wrong with Rodney. At first, the two divers thought that Rodney had just some sort of air failure or a problem with his regulator. Robert went first to see what happened. Brett followed closely. What they saw terrorized them. Rodney was fighting for his life against one of the whitetops. The shark had bitten into his thigh, and blood gushed from the wound in the water in green clouds. In the depth of the ocean, Rodney fought desperately against the monster, trying to pierce its eyes, punch its nose, anything to try and rid himself of the beast's jaws, but the white tip wouldn't let go. Unsure of where the second shark was, Robert and Brett swam down to help Rodney, punching at the white tip's torso to try and make it let Rodney go. That's when the second shark showed up and bit the same leg the first was worrying at, savagely ripping chunks of their friend's leg. The three men punched the sharks desperately, fighting for Rodney's life, until, as suddenly as they'd come, the two sharks let go. Robert and Brett dragged Rodney up the sand chute, half walking, half swimming up the corals. Their flight lasted less than 15 seconds. The first shark returned for Rodney, hitting him again and pulling him and Brett towards the drop-off. Brett was holding onto Rodney by the harness on his shoulder. Rodney, having lost a lot of blood, felt limp and lifeless in his friend's grasp. Then the second shark bit Rodney's other leg at the calf, bringing them down the chute, down and down into the abyss below. They'd sunk way past the 210 foot of the original dive now. Brett tried to shelter his friend into the corals, holding on to them to slow their descent. The sharks let go of Rodney once more and circled about 10 feet forward, watching their prey carefully. When Brett looked into Rodney's eyes, he saw that his friend was still alive. With the last of his strength, Rodney pushed Brett away from him, trying to surrender himself to the beasts. Brett was having none of it. He reached for Rodney's torso and came back with nothing. The sharks had disemboweled Rodney. Brett was terrified. He screamed into his mouthpiece in fury, and pulling Rodney from the coral, started kicking and pumping desperately to climb out of the deep. As soon as they got out of the relative safety of the corals, the sharks were at them again. Brett recalls one of the sharks actively pushing him away from Rodney, going back to bite the wounded diver. With one furious shake, the white tip turned what was left of Rodney Temple into a mist of blood and organs. Rodney was dead. Brett could only watch as his friend succumbed to the depths, dragged by the two beasts. Brett then realized that his oxygen had ended. At this point, he was way too far from the surface to make it calmly. Pulling strength from the depths of his soul, Brett started kicking the water in a steady rhythm, and he started praying. Kicking and kicking, he got as far as he could. The oxygen deprivation started to slowly drive him unconscious when he tried and got one last pull of oxygen from his equipment, enough to bring him into seeing distance of the surface. As he drifted into unconsciousness, his last thought was, "Damn, I almost made it." He woke up on the surface, spitting water and expanding air in his lungs. The air in his safety vest had been enough to float him to the surface, a miracle by all accounts. Brett swam to the shore as fast as his numb legs would allow. By the time he reached the shore, he could hardly stand. He was rescued by a couple on their honeymoon, barely managing to gasp enough instructions at them until he collapsed. Brett's prayers were answered in full. The wife was an ER nurse from Florida, and she could help Brett through his decompression sickness. Brett was taken to the hospital and medicated, but sustained lesions in his right eye that made him permanently blind in it. Robert later told Brett that his last sight of Rodney had been of him being dragged by Brett, and then the both of them being dragged down by the sharks. Fearing they'd both been killed, and already low on oxygen, Robert surfaced and reported them both as dead to the authorities. He never saw Brett's ascent and didn't know that Brett had survived until Brett himself had alerted the family of his survival. Rodney's service was held at the beach a week after his attack. His body was never recovered. He was 23 years old at the time of the attack. Brett retired from diving in 2006, logging over 17,000 successful dives. The two monsters that killed Rodney weren't acting out of malice or any premeditated attempt on the diver's life. They weren't territorial either, animals protecting their nests. They were just hunters, and in the water, there is no hunter as terrifying as a shark. What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments section down below. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, dive deeply into the like and subscribe buttons. See you again soon in another video, if you dare.